What was the dumbest thing you thought as a child? I used to think that once you finished a grade in primary school you became smarter than the teacher of that grade. That I would have to change my name when I grew up. I don't know why, but I thought my name was suitable for a child but definitely not for an adult, and I couldn't imagine being an adult with my name. I even talked to my mother about it, saying that at some point we'd eventually have to go to court to have it changed to something more adult sounding. Not something I believed, but a harmless prank I used to play on my kids. There is a highway we use that has several long, gentle curves over a 5 to 6 mile stretch. One day when my younger son complained that the sun was in his eyes, he was about 3 at the time, I had the idea to pretend that I had a personal relationship with Mr. Sun. I saw that the highway was going to curve, so I had a conversation with Mr. Sun explaining the situation and asking him to please move over, so that he wasn't shining in my son's eyes. I drew out the conversation and timed it so just when Mr. Sun agreed, we would start the curve and it looked like he was moving over and out of my son's eyes. Then after another curve, the sun would be in my other son's eyes, so I asked politely for Mr. Sun to move again, just as we went around the next curve. This went on for almost a year before my wife explained to them what was going on. It was hilarious in the meantime. That the Underground Railroad was a literal secret underground subway-style steam engine that Harriet Tubman was the conductor of. That if people are going to study something they just sit in a circle with other students and think about what they want to do. As soon as they find out, they are done and they can leave. I wish lol. When I was really young, I was convinced I was pregnant, I'm a man by the way, with a baby cat named Bridget. My family decided to see how long I would believe this, so they never told me how ridiculously impossible that was. I went on believing it for about 5 months. That's how long little me thought cat pregnancy lasted, and then when the baby never came, I went to my mom and asked when Bridget would be born. She finally told me that boys can't get pregnant and humans can't give birth to cats. I was traumatized. Little me was so excited to be a cat father, and then it was ripped away from me. I was such a stupid kid. Edit, since so many people keep asking. No, I never ended up getting a cat. And no, I didn't F a cat lamau. This would have been around 6 years old, and I was raised Catholic and thought God put babies in your stomach, so I thought he put a cat in me. And as for the name, I just really liked the name Bridget, and I still do. I used to believe that night is brought about by clouds, dark ones, of course. Never felt the need to clarify this with anybody, it was an obvious fact. When I was a young kid, maybe between 5 to 9, my dad took me to the tiny grass runway airport in my town, and we went on a short plane ride in a small Cessna around the valley. My dad sat in the back, and I was up front with the pilot. While we taxied off the ramp and out to the runway, I was given permission to move the yoke. I thought I was steering the aircraft the whole way. I told my mom that I taxied the plane. In school I told my class that I taxied the plane. In fact, it was so strong a memory that I grew up remembering the memory without evaluating the experience. I was home on leave from a naval aviation squadron when I was talking about that flight with my dad, and I was thinking about it, and I had this long pause, and I said, "Holy yes, Dad, I just realized that I wasn't steering that Cessna." My father laughed his ass off. I was very young and I blame Wizard of Oz, but I believed that a tornado was just one big phenomenon that continuously happened and spun from state to state, country to country. I also live in the South, so we have frequent tornado warnings, so I vaguely remember a time we had 2 or 3 warnings in 1 week, and I was scared the single tornado would come to our town and never go away. That there's a tiny human inside the TV who executed what the remote was telling him to do. For example, when you press the button to increase the volume, he is being hit in a specific way that lets him know that he has to go and manually increase the volume. My uncle is a priest for an obscure Hindu offshoot religion, and he told me quite young that I shouldn't play sport, because each person only gets a set number of breaths in their life and getting out of breath used them up quicker. I used to spend hours laying in bed trying to make my breaths as long and slow as possible. In fairness, I actually have a decent lung capacity as an adult, so maybe it had a positive effect. My dad lost his wedding ring in the bay during a fishing trip. He'd lost weight, his hand was wet and probably fish slimy, and it just fell right off and was lost forever to the water. I was absolutely inconsolable. It took my parents quite a while to get me to calm down enough to be able to explain why I was so upset about it. I thought it meant they were no longer married anymore. Lol. I grew up around the time of the release of the Star Wars prequels. I vividly remember asking my brother as to why they released the sequels, New Hope etc., before they released The Phantom Menace, as it made no sense when I was 11 and a prequel was a wild new concept to me. He had me convinced, embarrassingly until I was about 15/16, that the reason they released the sequels first was because there was a fire at the studio and it burned all the original tapes, so they had to reshoot them. I was so f***ing dense. I used to think my mom was such a good shopper. She would pick out all these groceries, and when she got up to the checker, she would only give them one piece of money, and they would give her several pieces of money back, and we got to keep the groceries. I asked my mom once why people had grey hair. Without missing a beat, she simply said, "From having kids." For many years I thought there was some biochemical process after having kids that caused one's hair to turn grey. I eventually learned different. Also figured out where I got my propensity for smartassery. I grew up in Ohio. You know, cows and corn and farms as far as the eye can see. Well, when I was young, I would often see these large hay rolls in the fields. And a lot of the time, these hay rolls would be wrapped in white plastic. I legitimately thought, for years, that these were giant marshmallows, and that this is where they came from. I believed they grew out in those fields like a plant, and that they were later chopped down to a smaller size before being sold. It took me way longer than I care to admit before I realized the truth. I believed hamburger and hot dog buns were only available for restaurants, not civilians. Mom used sliced bread, toasted to obliterate the gums, at home to make burgers and hot dogs. I believed that until the age of 10.